The groom threw the cake in the bride's face, but her response changed that night forever. Stay with us until the final scene. You'll see how a woman rewrote her own destiny. What was supposed to be the perfect wedding turned into the biggest scandal in high society, but what no one expected was that in her moment of greatest humiliation, she would find her true strength. Stay tuned until the end, because this is not just a story of betrayal, but of a woman who decided to rewrite her own destiny before it even began. I want to know where you are from. Leave your city or country in the comments. We're happy to know how far this story is reaching. The golden dome of the Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom shone under the light of the large crystal chandeliers. The opulence of the place reflected the magnitude of the event. The marriage between Isabella Ramirez and Fernando del Castillo was the union of two noble lineages, the perfect combination of the power of the Ramirez family and the aristocratic status of the Castillo family. Although the Castillo family had fallen into decline, the elite of New York City had gathered that night dressed in their finest, with glasses of champagne in hand and expectations of witnessing an event worthy of the cover of the most exclusive magazines. The atmosphere was exquisite, calculated down to the last detail. The string quartet played a piece by Debussy. The waiters glided by with silver trays of caviar canapes, and the chandeliers cast golden sparkles on the impeccable marble of the hall. From the outside, it looked like a perfect wedding, the epitome of romance and sophistication. But inside Isabella's chest, there was a restlessness she couldn't shake. She wore an exclusive design by Elena Raigadas, an ivory silk dress with a several-meter-long train, hand-embroidered with gold thread. Her hair was pulled back into an impeccable bun, revealing her elegant neck and the diamond tiara her mother had given her as a symbol of family tradition. But beneath all that perfection, her skin burned with a sense of alertness she could not ignore. Eyes rested on her, admiring her, envying her, but no one saw the truth. No one perceived the invisible weight of that commitment, which was more than a step toward happiness. She felt like she was being sentenced. Fernando, on the other hand, radiated confidence with his aristocratic bearing, his Italian-cut black suit, and his rehearsed smile. He walked among the guests like a host in his kingdom. From the moment the reception began, he behaved with that false gallantry that only Isabella could discern. He whispered sarcastic comments in her ear. When no one was listening, he squeezed her waist harder than necessary and corrected her posture with a sharp murmur. It was not love. It was domination. But the decisive moment came with the wedding cake. It was a masterpiece of pastry, a 5-tiered structure covered in white fondant with edible gold details, designed to represent the grandeur of the occasion. The photographers positioned themselves strategically, while the guests crowded around with their phones ready to immortalize the moment. Isabella held the silver knife with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Fernando, at her side, radiated satisfaction. She cut the first slice according to protocol. He took a small piece with his fingers and brought it to his lips. It was a symbolic gesture, the first bite shared as husband and wife. But then, the unexpected happened. Instead of tenderly bringing the piece to his mouth or Isabella's, Fernando squeezed the cake between his fingers and smashed it directly against his face. The impact was instantaneous. The cold icing spread across her skin, covering her cheek and nose. A deathly silence fell over the room. No one laughed. No one found it funny. Only Fernando let out a mocking laugh, expecting her to react with the submission he had always demanded. But Isabella did not react as he expected. Her heart was pounding, but not with shame or sadness. It was rage. She could feel the sticky sweetness sliding down her chin, the mixture of expensive flavors on her tongue, the camera flashes flashing in her periphery, capturing her humiliation in real time. She felt everyone's eyes on her, but all she could see was Fernando, the man she had decided on. Now he was revealing himself completely. It wasn't the cake. It wasn't the public embarrassment. It was the absolute certainty that he would never respect her. He looked at her, waiting for her reaction, hoping she would laugh, that she would play the same game, to play along like an obedient wife. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, And in that moment, she knew. This was not an isolated mistake. It was not impulsive. It was a declaration of power. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer the same. Something inside her had changed. And Fernando, even with his superior smile, did not notice. The silence in the room continued to weigh like a marble slab. Only the faint murmur of the guests broke the stillness, a murmur laden with disbelief and tension. The faces of the Mexican elite oscillated between bewilderment and discomfort, but no one dared to intervene. Isabella could feel every gaze on her skin, the sticky icing still clinging to her cheek. She brought a trembling hand to her face, not to clean herself, but to cling to the last shred of control she had left. Fernando continued to laugh. "Come on, my love," he said sarcastically, in that smug voice that Isabella knew so well. "Don't make that face. It's a joke." His dark eyes watched her with the expectation of someone who is used to receiving her submission without resistance. But something inside her fractured. For years, she had ignored the signs, rationalizing the red flags as mere nuances of Fernando's character. But now, under the golden light of the crystal chandeliers and before the gaze of hundreds of people, the truth became impossible to disguise. This marriage was not love. It never had been. The Ramirez and Del Castillo families had sealed their commitment with the same coldness with which business deals are closed. Isabella's family, owners of one of the most influential art gallery networks in the country, had considered this union a strategic transaction, for Fernando was a man descended from an aristocracy that, although diminished, still retained a certain political influence. For the Del Castillo family, Isabella was a golden ticket, the key to rescuing their declining legacy. And she, naive, had believed that with time she could transform this alliance into something real. She had wanted to believe in him from the beginning. Fernando had been charming, impeccable in his role as a sophisticated man, his words soft, his gestures way he made her feel special when it suited him. He knew exactly how to manipulate her, how to make her doubt her own perceptions, how to envelop her in empty promises. But now everything was falling apart. The murmurs intensified when Isabella took a step back, away from Fernando. He spoke in a low voice so that those closest to him could hear. "No one here wants to see a scene." Isabella felt her blood boil. A scene? He had humiliated her in front of everyone, exposed her lack of respect without even batting an eyelid, and now he expected her to bow her head and continue with the charade? No, not anymore. She took a deep breath, smelling the sweet aroma of the cake mingling with the expensive perfume of the guests and the metallic smell of champagne in the air. Her mind raced frantically to every warning she had ignored. The day he dismissed her achievements at the gallery with a simple, "They gave it to you because of your last name." The times he had corrected her in public, as if her voice needed to filter through him before it was valid. The subtle criticisms disguised as jokes. The comments that turned her independence into an offense. The moments when his touch became a little stronger, a little more controlling. She had believed they were small things. She had believed she could handle it. "Isabella," Fernando hissed through clenched teeth, taking a step closer. His jaw tensed when he noticed his wife was not reacting as he expected. "Don't make this bigger than it is." But it was too late. Isabella looked at him with a clarity she had never had before. And in that instant, she knew that her mistake had not been just marrying Fernando. Her mistake had to think she could change him. The voice of her brother Rodrigo snapped her out of her trance. "Are you okay?" he whispered, appearing at her side. His tone was not only concerned, it was warning. Fernando heard the question and frowned. "Of course she's fine," he replied for her. "It's just cake." Rodrigo looked at him with the contempt he had never tried to hide. "I'm not talking to you." The tension in the air became unbearable. Some guests exchanged nervous glances, while others waited morbidly for the outcome. Everyone knew that something was about to explode. Fernando turned to Isabella, leaning over slightly to whisper in her ear, "Behave yourself." It was that whisper that doomed him. Isabella felt a chill down her spine, the certainty that he had never seen her as his equal, only as something that had to behave in order to serve his purpose. And then she made a decision. A second later, She removed her veil and let it fall to the floor. The jewels in her hair sparkled under the lights as her hands trembled slightly. But it wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline of someone who had finally awakened. The murmurs turned into muffled gasps when, with her head held high, she removed her wedding ring and placed it on the table next to the cake that Fernando had used to humiliate her. For the first time all night, he lost his smile. "What are you doing?" His tone was no longer mocking. It was sharp. It was fear. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The guest's eyes followed her in disbelief as Isabella turned on her heels and walked toward the exit. There were no screams, no unnecessary drama, just the echo of her heels echoing on the marble as she left behind not only the wedding, but the biggest mistake of her life. Fernando stood in the middle of the hall, realized he had just lost control. The sound of her heels still echoed in the golden corridors of the Palace of San Angel when a firm hand stopped her. "Don't you dare make a scene, Isabella." It was Fernando. His voice no longer held a trace of mockery. It was an order. She turned slowly, the lights of the hall glistening on her cheeks, stained with frosting, but her expression was icy. There were no tears, no pleas, only determination. Fernando Becerril clenched his jaw, his dark eyes piercing with contained anger. Control was slipping from his hands, and he knew it. "Go back to the hall." Now the air around them was charged with electricity. A few meters away, a group of guests pretended not to look, but the rumor was undeniable. The scandal was taking shape. Isabella felt a wave of disgust. How long had she spent justifying that man, convincing herself that he was someone with whom she could build a life? "Let go of my arm." Her voice was low and firm, without a trace of pleading. Fernando hesitated. He had never heard her speak like that. She had always been the perfect woman, the one who conformed to expectations without questioning them. But now, standing in front of him with her dignity intact, she made him feel exposed. He clenched his teeth and let go of her. "Don't be ridiculous. Everyone is looking." He ran a hand through his hair, trying to regain his composure. She looked around and noticed a group of businessmen watching him with discreet attention. His image was at stake. That's when he changed his strategy. "Come on, Isabella," he said with a forced smile. "We're not going to ruin such an important night because of a misunderstanding, right?" She looked at him without blinking. "A misunderstanding? Yes, it was just a joke. You're overreacting." Fernando leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice. "Don't be dramatic." How many times had she heard that word come out of his mouth when he belittled her first exhibition in New York, and she got upset when he forgot her birthday, and she dared to mention it when he interrupted her at a dinner with his family, and she asked him not to be dramatic. It wasn't the first time, but it would be the last. Before she could respond, a new voice interrupted Isabella. "Everything's fine," said Rodrigo, her brother, accompanied by a couple of family friends. His expression was tense, his posture protective. There was no trust in his gaze, only alertness. Fernando changed his attitude instantly, his smile reappearing, the one he used to manipulate situations in his favor. "Everything's fine, brother-in-law. Just a little misunderstanding." Rodrigo didn't believe him for a second, but he didn't want to make the scandal any bigger. "You should go clean your face," he said gently to Isabella. "I'll take care of it." She nodded and took a step toward her brother, but Fernando wasn't going to let her go so easily. "Do you see what you're doing, Isabella?" His tone dropped. His smile hardened. "You're going to make a scene." She didn't answer. It wasn't worth it anymore, and she left without looking back at him. The bathroom was empty when Isabella looked at herself in the mirror. A distorted version of herself stared back at her. The immaculate white dress contrasted with the sweet stains on her face. It was the perfect image of what their relationship had been, a disguise of perfection covering a bitter truth. She took a deep breath and grabbed a wet towel as she wiped her face, also wiping the blindfold. When she returned to the room, everything had changed. The murmurs were more intense, the furtive glances more frequent. The gossip had already taken on a life of its own. In the distance, she saw Fernando surrounded by a group of businessmen. He seemed relaxed, but she knew him too well. She knew he was upset. She knew he was losing control of the narrative. She walked toward the main table with her head held high. She would not allow him to reduce her to the humiliated wife who needed to be comforted, but when she was close enough, she heard something that stopped her in her tracks. It's no surprise that she reacted that way. She's always been mental. Fernando was talking to the investors, and he was talking about her. I mean, you have to understand her. She's lived a privileged life. She's always had it easy. I guess the first real setback makes her react this way. Isabella felt a wave of icy indignation wash over her body. Fernando laughed lightly and took a sip of his whiskey. He knew perfectly well that she was there listening, but that's how they are. Sometimes they forget that without their last name, they would be nothing. The slap of his comment was louder than any previous humiliation. A lump formed in her throat, not from sadness, but from fury. The men at the table exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one dared to answer her. "Is this how you talk about me when I'm not around?" Isabella's voice resonated with a coldness that made Fernando turn his head immediately. Silence fell over the table. Fernando blinked, surprised that she had had the nerve to confront him. "Isabella, please don't continue. I want to hear everything." He clenched his jaw. For a moment, his mask cracked. The charming man disappeared, and the real Fernando appeared. Arrogant, hurtful, cruel. "Come on, Isabella. We all know that your career wouldn't exist without your family. It's a gallery, not an empire. Don't pretend that you got where you are on your own." Rage rose in his throat. "You're right. My family gave me opportunities. But tell me, Fernando, what has yours given you?" A murmur ran around the table. He felt the blow. "Sorry, I mean, if we're going to talk about who is relevant without their surname, you don't even have a career to boast about." The investors looked away uncomfortably. What she had just said was a direct blow. Fernando had no business of his own. He lived off his family's reputation, old contacts, appearances. He had always played influential, but in reality he was nothing more than an opportunist, and now everyone knew it. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure, but it was too late. "I need to talk to you alone." She stared at him, and for the first time in years she felt no fear of him. There's nothing more to say. And then, in an unexpected turn, Isabella took her champagne glass and toasted the men who think they can fool everyone but end up deceiving themselves. Fernando looked at her with fury, but there was nothing he could do because his mask had fallen. The atmosphere at the Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom had changed. It was no longer a wedding, it was a scandal in the making. The guests continued their conversations, the champagne glasses continued to be filled, the music still played from the orchestra's speakers, but everything felt forced. It was a farce. The murmurs spread like furious glances, tense smiles, whispers behind silk fans and crystal glasses. No one said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Fernando del Castillo was not the powerful man he tried to appear to be. At another table, a group of businessmen exchanged comments in low voices. Men who had previously shaken Fernando's hand with respect now spoke with a different caution. Doubts. That was the word. Doubts about whether he had bet too high. "She didn't look very happy when she left," whispered one, as he swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Did you see her take off her veil and leave it lying there? That's not a good sign." Another man, an investor who had considered doing business with Fernando, exhaled and shook his head. His family isn't going to let this go. The scales were tipping. The same people who had laughed with Fernando before, who flattered him, who saw his marriage to Isabel an opportunity to make connections with the Ramirez family, were now reconsidering their options. What if all this ended in disaster? Fernando felt that change. He perceived it as a chill down his spine. He was a man who had built his reputation on foundations of smoke. He knew that if he didn't regain control now, he would lose it forever. That's why he followed her as soon as Isabella left the event hall. He went after her and caught up with her in one of the corridors connecting to the palace's private gardens. He took her arm with a firmness that, although controlled, made his frustration clear. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She didn't turn around immediately. She closed her eyes for a second, feeling the weight of that question. It wasn't the first time Fernando had held her like this. It wasn't the first time he had tried to manipulate her. But this was the first time she was no longer afraid. When she finally turned to him, her expression was one of pure contempt. "I'm doing what I should have done from the beginning." Fernando clenched his jaw. There was contained rage in his gaze. "You're going to ruin everything for a stupid piece of cake," he sneered, although his voice trembled with slight desperation. "Don't be childish, Isabella." She let out a dry laugh without any childish humor. "It's not childish. It's that you think I'm going to continue with this after what you did." Fernando took a deep breath deeply, trying to stay calm. He couldn't lose his temper. Not there, not with everyone watching what was happening. "Listen." His tone became lower, more measured, as if he were negotiating a contract. "What happened in there was a mistake, a misunderstanding. We'll fix it. There's nothing to fix. Do you really think your family is going to let this end like this?" Now her voice became colder, sharper. "Do you think they're going to accept the ridicule of a wedding canceled on the same night?" Isabella felt a twinge in her chest. He knew where to strike. The Ramirez family had built their empire on reputation and impeccable strategies. A scandal of this magnitude was a stain on their name, but Fernando didn't understand that she was no longer playing by his rules. "My family will take care of what needs to be done." Her voice didn't tremble. "But I'm not going to go through with this." Fernando let out an ironic laugh and shook his head. "And what do you plan to do? Annul the marriage?" "Yes." His smile disappeared for the first time. Real fear appeared on his face. "You can't do that." "Yes, I can." He ran a hand nervously across his face. His control was crumbling faster than he could repair it. "Listen, honey." He tried to soften his tone, but his desperation seeped into every word. "Don't be impulsive. Not after everything we've planned. What we've planned. Not what we've built together. Not what we've dreamed of." Isabella felt nauseous. "You know what will happen if we do this now. Your family will lose credibility. It will look like a public offense to the Castillos. Is that what you want?" Guilt was his last card. He had used it so many times that it almost seemed like an automatic reflex, and for a moment, it worked. Isabella hesitated. She thought of her father, her mother, the critical glances of society that did not forgive weaknesses. Fernando noticed and pressed further. "You don't have to make this decision now. Let's talk tomorrow calmly. We'll sit down with the lawyers and find a smart solution, a solution that will benefit you." Isabella understood in that instant. Fernando was not trying to save their relationship. He was trying to save himself because without her, he was nothing. Power had changed hands, and he knew it. She looked at him with absolute clarity. "I'm not going to talk to the lawyers tomorrow, Fernando. I'm going to talk to them now." He blinked, his face changing from contained anger to absolute coldness. "Don't do this, Isabella." She took a step back, her expression showing no fear, only determination. "I already did." And she left him there, in that golden hallway, with his desperation reflected in every shadow of the chandeliers. Isabella returned to the living room with firm steps, feeling the heat of every gaze piercing her back. She knew everyone was waiting for her next move. The music continued to play, but it had lost its purpose. The guests spoke in whispers, pretending to hide their discomfort, but it was impossible to conceal the tension that hung in the air. The scandal was now real. In the distance, Fernando had returned to his seat at the main table, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and a frown on his face. His posture pretended calm, but she knew him too well. His clenched jaw, his fingers drumming impatiently on the table, his gaze scanning the room in search of allies. He was losing control, and he knew it, but he had not yet accepted defeat. Isabella moved forward without deviating, feeling her heart beat with overwhelming force. It was not fear, it was clarity. The dress weighed heavily on her body. The veil brushed the floor with a subtle rustle. It was the image of a perfect bride, but it was all a lie. When she reached the center of the room, she felt the conversation slowly die down. Everyone's eyes were fixed on her. It was time. Slowly, she brought her hands to her head and slid the veil off. The seemingly simple gesture was a devastating blow. The veil fell to the floor like a leaf in autumn, soft but definitive. There was no turning back. Fernando immediately stood up, his chair scraping a sharp noise against the marble. "What are you doing?" His voice struggled to remain controlled, but his panic was evident. Isabella did not respond. She removed her wedding ring with calculated precision. The diamond, once a symbol of a shared future, was now just a worthless stone in her hand. She dropped it on the table, with a slight clink against the glass. The sound, though insignificant, echoed like a gunshot in the room. Fernando took a step toward her, his hand outstretched as if trying to stop the inevitable collapse of his world. He reached for Isabella, but she had already made her decision. Without a cry, without a single tremor in her voice, without tears, she turned and began to walk toward the exit. The murmuring among the guests turned into a river of stifled reactions. No one could believe what they were seeing. Cell phone cameras were subtly raised the moment the bride abandoned her own wedding. The investors watched in silence, some exchanging knowing glances. The ridicule was not for Isabella, it was for Fernando, and he knew it. Isabella's voice finally betrayed her desperation. She did not stop. Her heels echoed on the marble. Every step she took was another crack in the image Fernando had built. Every meter she walked away, he became more insignificant. He tried to follow her, but Rodrigo appeared out of nowhere, standing in front of him with a fierce look. "No, Fernando." He looked at him with rage. He knew he couldn't push him. He couldn't react violently in front of everyone. He couldn't afford to lose another one, so he stood there watching as his wife, not his ex-wife, left the place with her head held high. When the large wooden door closed behind her, he knew he had lost everything. That night, New York City burned with golden lights. Traffic flowed between avenues like an endless river of white and red headlights. From the presidential suite of the Four Seasons, the view of the city was an impressive spectacle. But inside the room, the atmosphere was one of pure tension. Isabella sat on a dark velvet sofa, her wedding dress still impeccable. Although the absence of the veil and the ring made it clear that the illusion was over, she looked serene, but the energy in her body was electric. It wasn't sadness, it was not fear, it was something else. In front of her, Rodrigo Ramirez paced back and forth with his cell phone glued to his ear. His black suit was still perfectly tailored, but his tie was loose and his gestures were quick and impatient. He was not a man who lost control easily, but tonight was personal. "No, Arturo, I want it now. Not tomorrow, not in 2 days, now." Her voice was sharp, her patience non-existent. "The annulment request and send it to the Del Castillo office before dawn. I don't want Fernando to have a second to react." On the other side of the sofa, his mother, Teresa Ramirez, remained silent, her glass of red wine trembling slightly in her hand. She was not a woman who ever showed weakness, but tonight her dark eyes reflected a mixture of fury and disappointment. "What a shame," she finally whispered. The silence in the room. "He used us," Isabella said, closing her eyes for a moment. Yes, Fernando never loved her. He never wanted a marriage. He just wanted access to the Ramirez money and power. Rodrigo hung up abruptly and threw the phone on the table. "The lawyer is on his way. We're going to dismantle this mess before Fernando even understands what happened." Isabella looked up, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He can try for an annulment." Rodrigo snorted. "He can try, but he has nothing to work with. We haven't signed anything that benefits him." Teresa set her glass down on the table with more force than necessary. "But he's going to fight, Rodrigo. A man like Fernando doesn't let himself be humiliated without a fight. Quick check. If you were in Isabella's place, would you confront him or cut ties for good? Tell me in the comments." Isabella knew her mother was right. Fernando wasn't going to accept defeat quietly, and she was right. A few miles away, in the enormous Del Castillo mansion, Fernando stormed in. If this moment has you holding your breath, tap like. It really helps more people find this story. His tie was already off, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. He threw a glass against the marble wall, the glass exploding into 1,000 pieces. His mother, Gabriela del Castillo, watched him from one of the chairs in the living room, her posture rigid, but her expression impenetrable. She said nothing. His father, Javier del Castillo, a man who had once been respected in high society circles, but now lived in the shadows of his surname, rubbed his face in frustration. "Tell me you have at least something in your favor." Fernando took a deep breath, trying to calm down. He knew he needed to regain control. "The marriage is still valid," he said through clenched teeth. "There is still room to negotiate." Gabriela exhaled with disdain. Negotiate what? How can you sit down and ask for something when your wife left you in front of all of New York? Fernando felt a pang of anger. He hated that word. Left as if he had no control, as if he were the loser. I'm going to talk to her. Javier let out a sarcastic laugh. Don't be an idiot. Isabella is no longer an option. Fernando closed his eyes, his jaw tense. No, he wasn't going to accept that. He leaned over the table, his dark eyes shining with dangerous intensity. The Ramirez family is not going to want a bigger scandal than they already have. If they play their cards right, they can silence this. Gabriela stared at him, and if they don't, Fernando smiled, but it wasn't a smile of calmness. It was the smile of someone who refuses to lose. Then I'll do it my way. Back in the suite, the door burst open. The Ramirez family lawyer, Arturo Mendieta, entered with a briefcase in his hand and an expression of urgency. We have to act fast. Rodrigo took the documents and began to review them without wasting a second. Every clause was designed to eliminate any possibility of Fernando getting a penny. Enjoying this power shift? Subscribe so you don't miss the next twist. Isabella, said Arturo, approaching her. Are you completely sure? She didn't hesitate. Yes, there's nothing to save. Arturo nodded and slid the document in front of her. Sign here. Isabella took the pen. Her hand didn't tremble. With a single stroke, she broke the last connection that tied Fernando del Castillo. Rodrigo smiled with satisfaction. Let the notification reach him before dawn. I want him to read it with the worst hangover of his life. Teresa watched her daughter in silence, then took her hand firmly. I'm proud of you. Isabella felt a lump in her throat, but she didn't cry. She had no reason to. She had her life back, and Fernando, still in his mansion, didn't yet know that the war was already lost. She dared to hope, had not yet fully awakened when Fernando's cell phone began to vibrate insistently on the nightstand in his suite at the Del Castillo mansion. The irritating ring mixed with the throbbing pain in his head, a remnant of the previous night, which had ended with more alcohol than strategy. He moved in bed, the linen sheets rumpled, and stretched out his arm with a sudden movement to grab the device. On the screen, the name of his lawyer flashed insistently. Fernando closed his eyes for a moment before answering. He knew it wasn't good news. What's going on? He growled in an impatient, hoarse voice. You have to come to the office right now. Fernando frowned. He never liked Tomas. Anxious, Tomas moved aside enough for Fernando to see that the courts had annulled the marriage before it was consummated. Fernando sat up in bed with a start. Listen to me carefully. Isabel signed the annulment last night. Her lawyers sent the documentation while you were sleeping. Legally, you and she were never married. The room seemed to be in turmoil. He passed a hand over his face, trying to absorb the information. That couldn't be happening. It was impossible. It was a fact. Fernando, you have no rights. There are no agreements signed in your favor. There is no access to the Ramirez accounts. There is absolutely nothing you can claim. Fernando jumped up and paced the room like a caged animal. They must have committed a legal error. There isn't. Rodrigo Ramirez played his cards right. And the worst thing is, that's not all, Fernando. Clenching his teeth, the worst thing is, what else? Tomas let out a heavy sigh. The scandal is already in the press. The whole city of New York knows that Isabella left you at the altar. Fernando clenched his fists, his eyes burning with pure rage. Your whore. Tell me that at least we have how to respond. If there were a signed contract, we could fight. But there isn't. You can't demand compensation. You can't claim assets. You have nothing. Fernando slammed his cell phone against the wall with force, and it shattered into pieces. A void took over his chest, soon replaced by a fury that threatened to consume him. Isabella finished him off. He grabbed the first shirt he found and put it on with rough gestures. He couldn't leave things like that. He would not accept defeat. He left the room like a furious bear, pacing down the marble hallway of the mansion. He found Gabriela sitting in the main room with a newspaper in her hands and an expression of disgust on her face. She slowly raised her eyes to the edge. What a shame. Fernando stopped in the middle of the room, still boiling inside. What a shame, my mother. Gabriela. Newspaper on the coffee table. Brutal headline. The wedding of the year ended before it began. Isabella Ramirez abandons Fernando del Castillo at the altar. Fernando still a pawn. It's a public humiliation. Gabriella's voice was icy. And all because you couldn't control your wife. Fernando slammed his fist on the table, knocking over an empty cup. Isabella is not my wife. She never was, thanks to those damn lawyers. Gabriella, you're loaded with X's, and now you have nothing. Fernando, you're still burning with F. It's not over yet. Javier de Castillo entered the room at that moment. He seemed to know how to swallow. It was clear that his voice was like a sharp knife. You were left without money and without allies, Fernando. He turned to him, anger pulsing in his veins. I can still do it, Javier. Come on, you lost tonight, son. Fernando felt the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. He didn't accept it. He wouldn't give up. He grabbed his car keys and left. He would go after Isabella, and this time he wouldn't lose. The sun hadn't yet fully risen when Fernando's cell phone began to vibrate insistently on the nightstand of his suite in the Del Castillo mansion. The irritating tone, mixed with the throbbing pain in his head, a reminder of the previous night that had ended with more alcohol than strategy. He moved in bed, the linen sheets rumpled, and reached out with a sudden movement to grab the phone. On the screen was the name of his lawyer, Tom Echeverria. Fernando closed his eyes for a moment before answering. He knew it wasn't good news. "What's going on?" he growled, his voice hoarse and impatient. "You have to come to my office now." Fernando frowned. He never liked Tomas's anxious tone. "Tell me now." The silence on the other end was brief, but enough for Fernando to feel a warning chill. The Ramirez family annulled the marriage before consummating it. Fernando jumped up in bed. "Listen to me carefully. Isabella signed the annulment last night. Her lawyers sent the paperwork while you were sleeping. Legally, you and she were never married." The room seemed to shrink around him. He ran a hand over his face, trying to process the information. This couldn't be happening. That's impossible. It's a fact, Fernando. You have no rights. There are no agreements signed in your favor. There is no access to the Ramirez accounts. There is absolutely nothing you can claim. Fernando jumped to his feet. He paced the room like a caged animal. There must be a legal error. There isn't. Rodrigo Ramirez played his cards right. And the worst part is, that's not it. Fernando clenched his teeth. The worst part? What else? Tomas let out a heavy sigh. The scandal is already in the press. All of New York City knows that Isabella left you at the altar. Fernando clenched his fists, his eyes burning with pure rage. His reputation. Tell me we at least have that. If there were a signed contract, we could fight. But there isn't. You can't demand compensation. You can't claim assets. You have nothing. Fernando threw the cell phone against the wall with force, shattering the device into pieces. A void took hold of his chest, quickly replaced by a fury that threatened to consume him. Isabella had destroyed him. He grabbed the first shirt he found and dressed himself with abrupt movements. He couldn't leave things like this. He would not accept defeat. He stormed out of the room like a hurricane, his footsteps echoing in the marble hallway of the mansion. On the ground floor, he found Gabriela del Castillo, his mother, sitting in the main living room with a newspaper in her hands and a look of disgust on her face. She slowly looked up at her son. What a shame. Fernando stopped in the middle of the room, still burning inside. How embarrassing. They screwed me over, Mom. Gabriela dropped the newspaper on the coffee table. On the front page was a brutal headline. The wedding of the year ended before it began. Isabella Ramirez abandons Fernando del Castillo at the altar. Fernando felt a twinge in his stomach. It's public humiliation. Gabriela's voice was icy. And all because you couldn't control your wife, Fernando. He slammed the table with his hand, knocking over an empty glass in the process. Isabella is not my wife. She never was, thanks to those damn lawyers. Gabriela looked at him with disdain. Exactly. And now you have nothing. Fernando felt his eyes burn with rage. It's not over yet. Javier del Castillo, his father, entered the room at that moment. He already seemed to be aware of the tragedy. Of course, it's over. His voice sounded like a sharp knife. You're left with no marriage, no money, and no allies. Fernando turned to him, rage pulsing through his veins. I can still fix this. Javier let out a dry laugh. Fix what? Your dignity? That was lost last night, son. Fernando tasted defeat in his mouth, but he wouldn't accept it. Not yet. Without another word, he grabbed his car keys and left the mansion. He was going to find Isabella, and this time, he wasn't going to lose her. Rain was beginning to fall on New York City when Fernando slammed on the brakes in front of the Four Seasons, the tires skidding on the wet asphalt. The early morning cold seeped into his clothes, but the heat of his fury was much greater. He got out of the car and handed the keys to the valet without even looking at him. His mind had only one goal: Isabella. The mirrored windows of the hotel reflected his own face, his dark eyes, his tense jaw, desperation poorly concealed behind arrogance. He couldn't let her win, not now. He entered the reception area like a whirlwind, ignoring the discreet glances of the employees. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew why he was there. "Mr. Del Castillo, Mrs. Ramirez is not receiving visitors," said the receptionist, his voice rehearsed but with a slight tremor. "No, don't make me repeat myself," growled Fernando, his eyes fixed on the man. "Give me her room number." The receptionist hesitated. "I'm going to have to ask you to—" Fernando wasn't listening anymore. He crossed the lobby, ignoring any rules, any limits. The elevator was too slow, so he ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, feeling his breathing quicken with each step. Isabella couldn't do this to him, not after everything. When he reached the door of the presidential suite, he knocked hard. Isabella's silence on the other side only made his blood boil more. "Open the door." No response. He clenched his fists. He knew she was there, so he tried one last time. "If you don't open it, I'm coming in anyway." On the other side of the door, Isabella took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding, but her face showed no emotion. Rodrigo leaned against the wall of the room and crossed his arms. "You don't have to talk to him, Isabella." She looked at him. Her brother. He had always been her strength, her protection, but this fight was hers. "Yes, I have to do it." Before Rodrigo could argue, she turned the handle and opened the door. Fernando paused for a moment, as if deep down he hadn't expected her to respond. His eyes scanned her face, looking for some doubt, some hesitation, but he found nothing. Isabella was calm, too calm. That enraged him even more. "You're going to listen to me." She didn't move. She didn't give him any room to him to enter. She just crossed her arms and waited. Fernando ran a hand through his wet hair, taking a deep breath, trying to regain control. He had to bring her back into the game. "You can't do this to me." His voice came out less firm than he wanted. "You can't destroy us like this." Isabella tilted her head slightly. "We never existed." Fernando clenched his teeth. She spoke as if he had meant nothing. He took a step forward, ignoring the fact she wasn't backing down. "Isabella, think. This isn't just a relationship. It's a pact between our families. If you leave me like this, it will be a disaster." She blinked slowly, absorbing every word. "For whom?" Fernando clenched his fists. "For everyone. For you and me. For you." And there it was, the truth slipping away like the rain outside. Fernando felt a lump in his throat. He couldn't let her have the last word. "You know what the press is saying," his voice lowering, becoming more dangerous. "You were impulsive. It was a rich girl's whim. If you continue with this, they will tear Isabella's heart apart." It beat strongly. She knew she wasn't lying, but she also knew that Fernando needed her to be afraid. So she smiled. "Cruel little thing. If you think I care what they say, then you never knew me." The frustration in Fernando's eyes grew. "You can't do this." She shook her head. His voice lost strength. "You can't throw it all away." Isabella kept her gaze fixed on him. She finally saw Fernando as he really was. Not a powerful man, not an unshakable aristocrat, just a desperate opportunist. "I already did." Fernando felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. For a moment it seemed as if he was going to insist, that he was going to say something, try one last move, but then he saw in her eyes that there was nothing left to do. No argument, no threat, no plea. It was over. He had lost. Isabella took a step back and held the door open. "Go, Fernando." He stood there for a second longer, then let out a shaky sigh, looked away, and stepped back. The door closed in front of him. Fernando stood in the hallway, feeling the humiliation seep into his skin like a slow poison. It was all over, and for the first time, Isabella was free. The city awoke that morning to a frenzy of scandalous headlines, incessant notifications on the cell phones of the elite, and urgent calls among the most powerful. The wedding of the year had not only failed, it had imploded before everyone's eyes. The front pages of the newspapers were stamped with shocking images. Isabella Ramirez, impeccable in her silk dress, walking out of the Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom with her head held high. Fernando del Castillo, alone in the hall, with a lost look and humiliation marked on his face. The wedding of the year ended in disaster. Isabella Ramirez left Fernando del Castillo before the honeymoon. The scandal shook Mexican high society. Speculation took over the press and social media. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. The more discreet whispered that Fernando had made an irreparable mistake. Others, more aggressive, suggested that he had never been worthy of Isabella, but the most astute had already understood the truth. Fernando del Castillo was not who he claimed to be. In the ruthless world of the Mexican elite, real money and lasting power belonged to the Ramirez family. The del Castillo family, on the other hand, was nothing more than an aristocratic surname that survived on appearances, and now that facade was destroyed. At the Polo Club, where businessmen and politicians gathered, the name was uttered with contempt. Between glasses of champagne, the same men who had previously shaken his hand now treated him like a joke. "I always thought he was overrated," commented one of the guests, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "He really thought he could fool the Ramirez family. The idiot lost his wife, his money, and his reputation in a single night," replied another, laughing sarcastically. Fernando del Castillo's downfall was complete. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Isabella breathed in the fresh air of her freedom in the penthouse, where she had taken refuge after the disaster. She gazed at the city skyline with a hot cup of coffee in her hands. She was tired, yes, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of living a lie. Rodrigo entered the room and threw a newspaper on the table. "Look at this." She quickly read the headlines. Fernando was sinking deeper and deeper. "He brought it on himself," she said without emotion. Rodrigo sat down across from her, crossing his arms. "And what are you going to do now?" Isabella brought the cup to her lips and smiled slightly. "I'm going to rebuild myself, but this time on my own terms." The warm wind of Tulum blew gently against her skin as Isabella walked barefoot on the fine white sand, feeling the soft texture under her feet. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, tinting the sky with shades of orange and pink, as if the entire universe were welcoming her to her new life. Gone were the cold marble floors, the blinding lights of the ballrooms, the voices full of judgment disguised as courtesy. Gone was the shadow of Fernando del Castillo, the surname that never had more weight than she allowed it to have. She stopped in front of the sea, the rhythm of the waves creating a constant, hypnotic sound. That was how her soul felt at that moment. She had once been a woman trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by riches but without true freedom. Now she was free, creating a constant, hypnotic sound. That was how her soul felt at that moment. She had once been a woman trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by riches but without true freedom. Now, for the first time, the world belonged to her. She took a deep breath. The salty air filled her lungs, as if purging the last vestiges of the life she had left behind. Her escape from New York City was not an impulsive act. It was an act of survival. For too long, she had been defined by her surname, by the expectations others had of her, the perfect daughter, the successful businesswoman, the ideal wife. It was all a carefully constructed image, an illusion that had finally collapsed the night she walked out of her own wedding. And in that collapse, she found her freedom. Isabella walked slowly back to the private villa where she had decided to settle for a while. No unnecessary luxuries, no ostentatious decorations, just the essentials. She opened the sliding wooden door and entered her new space. The smell of fresh wood and salt permeated the air. Her suitcases were to one side, still not completely unpacked. She was in no hurry. For the first time in her life, she had no rigid plan, no need to rush to meet anyone else's expectations. She crossed the room, and reached the small makeshift studio she had set up with an easel and a blank canvas. Isabella had been surrounded by art for years. Her professional life revolved around discovering and promoting talent, opening spaces for other artists to shine. But in the midst of that world, she had forgotten that she herself had once dreamed of creating. Until now. She picked up a brush and slid it over the palette of colors, red, blue, yellow, mixing them between her fingers, feeling the texture of the paint on her skin. It was something real, something that no one could take away from her. She had spent her whole life trying to fit into a mold. Now she was ready to break it. She rested the brush on the canvas and began to paint. At first, the strokes were uncertain, small flashes of contained emotion. But as the paint slid across the canvas, her hand became firmer, freer. Each brushstroke carried a story. The day she understood that her marriage was not love, but a contract. The moment Fernando humiliated her in front of everyone, believing she would remain silent. The moment she took off her veil and left behind not only the wedding, but the entire charade that had been her life. So many times she had been told who she should be. Now she would define herself. She lost herself in the painting, in the sound of the sea in the background, in the freedom she felt from not being tied to anything or anyone. She was not Fernando's wife. She was not the Ramirez's daughter. She was not a surname or a scandal, nor a socialite. She was Isabella, a woman who rebuilt her life on her own terms. She put down her paintbrush and picked up her cell phone. Dozens of unread messages. Some from high society acquaintances pretending to be concerned, but eager to hear the details of the scandal. Others from cautious former partners, wondering if this media blow would affect their business. She didn't answer any of them. She owed them nothing. But there was a message from Rodrigo. Do whatever you want, Isa. Wherever you are, do it for yourself. Her brother smiled. He had always been her anchor, her protector. But this time, she knew she could stand on her own. She got up and walked to the terrace. The wind caressed her skin, warm and full of promise. She had left her old life in ruins, and from those ruins she would build something completely new, something that was hers, something that no one could take away from her. What had begun as a night of humiliation ended up becoming a symbol of strength. She was no longer afraid. For the first time in her life, the future was hers.